Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sober Yoga Girl podcast. I am so excited to be sitting down today with Kyle Jason Lietzke. And Kyle and I have known each other online for like probably around a year and have been connecting and just kind of chatting through a mutual friend about his upcoming retreat to Bali, which is really exciting. So we're going to finally meet in person next month. And Kyle is a fulfillment coach. He's an Ayurvedic coach and counselor, and he also facilitates men's groups. And I'm really excited to have him here on the show today. And we're going to be talking a little bit about his history with binge eating and how he segued into work in Ayurvedic medicine. So welcome, Kyle. How are you?
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, thank you for that. It's an honor to be here and on the Sober Yoga Girl podcast. So appreciate you extending the invite. And yeah, I'm super excited to come to Bali and get to meet you in person, and really appreciate just all of your kindness in helping that manifest and come to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah, you're going to have a great time. And the retreat center that Kyle is hosting at is one of my favorite centers. I actually live in the other property that's owned by these same people. And I've had many retreats at both of their centers and they're just incredible. So I know it's going to be top notch.
Thank you. Yes, it'll be powerful.
So I just have a question for you before we start. I said your work in Ayurvedic medicine, and then I wanted to ask you, is that correct that I called it Ayurvedic medicine? Like, would you call it Ayurvedic medicine or would you call it something else?
That's a great question. There is Ayurvedic medicine.
Right.
I would say I work as an Ayurvedic counselor here in the US, the way that's classified. I focus more on lifestyle as medicine, food as
Mhm.
medicine. I don't do maybe medicine as we think of in the West
Yeah.
as the deeper diagnosis and prescription. Even Ayurvedic doctors throughout the world, India and the US, they practice a deeper level of medicine. So it's, as an Ayurvedic counselor, I work with lifestyle and food as medicine, I think would be the
Okay.
synthesis of that. Yeah.
Cool. Cool. So glad I asked you. So I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about your history. Like, what was your struggle with binge eating when you were younger?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for this. It really started with a traumatic event when I was 7 years old. It was actually 10 days before my seventh birthday is when my older brother, Ryan, was killed in a hit and run car accident. And that loss triggered a lot of different things, but this overeating and binge eating habit was my coping of trying to fill my void, was food and comforting myself with that. So that's where it really started, I believe. And then mixed with culturally, like I was a family where we filled our plate and finished our plate, and that kind of gave some fuel to that fire with looking to cope with food for comfort.
Wow. You know, I haven't had someone on the podcast yet before who, like, I've been so focused on alcohol as an addiction, and I haven't really brought in people with other addictions or things like this. And what struck me as you share that is like it's such a similar thing of like a traumatic instance. In most cases, like people have had some kind of trauma that's been unprocessed or unresolved, and that's what's caused their addictive behavior. And that's really struck me how it's like a similar root, but a different manifestation, you know?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and we talked about this when you invited me. I was like, well, I don't have a sober story with alcohol, but my compulsive behavior and addictive behavior has been more around eating and food.
Yeah.
And this actually being really the first time I've shared more publicly around my um, challenge with that.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing because I know it's like a pretty vulnerable thing.
Yeah, and that's my thing. Well, open book and sharing that, and know that people are going through their stuff. And from what I know of addiction too, it's finding that thing that gets us close but not quite there, right? Um, I think I've heard you talk about like the opposite of addiction is connection, and we're looking for that connection to something, to ourselves, to the other people that we're missing, or whatever sense of fulfillment or desire that we want to feel full and whole. And it's the whatever our vices or mechanism is to get close to that or have that for a moment, but um, is fleeting.
Mhm. So I was wondering when this experience happened when you were 7, um, were there any did you have any coping kind of strategies or anything offered? Like, did you do any counseling, or what kind of support was there for you as you navigated this?
Yeah, good question. You know, I do remember going to counseling a couple times,
Mhm.
um, and didn't persist. So I don't know the full story of, why my parents didn't keep me in or whatnot, but I do remember going a couple times. I was raised in a religious household. We were a Christian family, so I went to church regularly and went to a Christian school growing up. So I had those types of things. But at 7, I don't think I had a lot of practices and tools to do it. And while I lost my brother, my parents lost their son, and my siblings lost their brother too. So it's like whole family was really in a loss and trying to figure it out. Um, so I guess my short answer is I don't think I had much to turn to.
Gosh, yeah, that must have been so difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do believe only now I think we're developing awareness around those needs, which is really just processing and having support for moving through the trauma we've experienced, because I think trauma is unavoidable in life. Like, everyone is going to have some experience of trauma, and it's just how we're able to resolve it and work through it. And I know, when I was younger, it just wasn't something that was as widely discussed. And so and unresolved trauma is where issues would manifest in the body and the mind. And
Totally. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we all have traumas. And
yeah.
from the yogic view, like I understand these as samskaras. These are our grooves and our patterns based on our karmas that our dharmas helps us work through.
Mm,
So,
I love that
yeah.
you brought that up, because there's not that many people that it's a niche of people that can connect with yoga sutra concepts. So I love that.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, if you feel like we need to unpack that for our listeners, let me know. But I
Hmm.
definitely agree with you on, I think definitely in my world, like trauma and something was not something I heard about in my family growing up. And there wasn't, so I think in the last few decades in our generation, just the awareness around mental health, spiritual health, these traumas, how the body keeps our story, um, of these patterns, and how to process these traumas. And really how in my studying with trauma is it's the energy, it's the prana that gets stuck
Yeah.
in this body, right? That's what the body keeps the score, that classic book. I like the story better than the score, um because we can rewrite that. And and what the yogic practices and a lot of spiritual practices help us do is move that prana, move that energy, get that flowing more optimally. And that's the healing that we find.
And let's talk about those terms. So you said samskaras. Maybe you can explain to the listeners who maybe haven't heard that term, where it comes from. What does it mean?
Okay, yeah, you help me out here. I don't know exactly where it comes from. It's a Sanskrit word,
Mhm.
so it's part of the Sanskrit Vedic lineage. And how I understand it is it's these patterns or grooves. So there's these energetic patterns that we have as individuals. And from the Vedic view, the spiritual view, how I understand it is we have these karmas from our other lives that we come here to work through. And then also so that's our nature. And then our nurturing, the traumas and experiences we have, especially in our early years, is like adds to that or influences that in various ways. So I think there's been a lot of I've noticed a lot more awareness in the Western psychology and wellness and health of focusing a lot on like our childhood traumas. And then I think the Vedic view has been knowing it for a deeper level and for millennia and for time immemorial, really.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I don't know where it originates from, but I do think there's a Yoga Sutra and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras on samskaras. I know that's
Mm,
the context in which I usually teach it under.
okay.
But it's so true what you're saying about, modern psychology introduce all these themes. And then as you study the Yoga Sutras, you're like, oh, wait, that's positive psychology. And like, that's your habits and that's your traumas. And that's like anxiety. And there's, addiction. And so all of these concepts actually came up thousands of years ago, which shows that humans have had the same issues for like all time.
Yeah, the yogis know some things. I like to
Mm.
like to joke about. And I'm inspired to go a little bit, maybe explain. So with this concept of these samskaras being these grooves or patterns, how I like to visualize it is we're an energetic body. I think physicists say like we are actually 99% energy in our volume because at every cell is inside every atom is energy. It's just space, right? The ether element. And in our material body, they say we're 70% water and so forth, but we're so much energy. So in this energetic body, this auric field, for another phrase, is we have these areas where we maybe have a groove or a pattern to have energy get stuck, where we have this maybe um, blemish or pattern that it's easy to get something stuck in this area, physically and emotionally. And so when we have these experiences in life, that's where our kind of quote Achilles heel or our score and story in our body comes, whether it's like our hips or back or shoulders, these things. And so it's fascinating.
Yeah, there's like such a big connection to what's happening in our body and then what's happening in our mind and then connecting to what's happening in our body.
Totally. And on that note, I love to say sometimes in the yogic space specifically, for instance, like I'll talk with people like I want to get out of my mind and just in my body. But from an Ayurvedic view, um, they're inextricably connected. It's more about integrating my mind with my body, being present in the asana practice, the pranayama practice, the meditation practice. That would be dharan or dhyan. Um, so
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's like coming into presence instead of like maybe leaving it or escaping it.
exactly, I like to say I'm not trying to like elevate. I'm trying to integrate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. That's
Yeah.
amazing. So I'm wondering, like, okay, so when you were having these binge eating issues, like how did that manifest and how did it negatively impact your life?
Yeah. Well, one, it definitely became an identity of mine too as I got older. Like you look at me now, I'm very fit, healthy adult individual, but I became an obese kid. And I'll share some of the habits that it kind of things that were there that I didn't realize till like in my mid 20s, like, oh, this is a thing. But part of my identity was I was at a young age, I was told, you're going to be a football player. And so that was okay. Okay, I'm going to be a professional football player. I mean, I had other things occasionally, but there was that. So, and then as I was big, I was as a big offensive lineman football player, there was a reason to be big. But I remember as a teenager, I had a neighbor that's like, you're just like a garbage disposal. If like I don't want to eat anything, just give it to you and you'll eat it. And I was like, yeah, I'm a garbage disposal, and like took pride in this identity piece, which was really interesting, right? But definitely issues around being self-conscious and insecure about my body. Um, there was practices of like inhaling my food, just really gobbling at my food, eating really fast, um, eating when I'm bored. I still have a habit. I remember even as a young kid in a commercial, go to the fridge, open it up, you know,
Mm.
and like it's still a habit. Sometimes I do. I'll just go open the fridge and look, and I'm like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
It's still these like ingrained little habits. Um, and then definitely a lot of guilt and shame. Like once I would um, eat and feel sick sometimes. There's guilt and shame associated with that, and also the problem of stopping. Of I know I'm full, I'm having awareness, but I'm also not stopping putting food in my mouth, and like those types of things. Which when I hear people struggling with alcohol or like once I have a drink I can't stop, like that, when I started hearing that I was like, oh, I have that with food sometimes. So those were some of the, I think, habits and ways it was negatively impacting me with just body issues and guilt and shame and um, habits like that with eating when I'm bored and eating just unconsciously.
This is so interesting that you're sharing about this because I feel like I can relate to so many aspects of what you just shared because I often describe it. Someone said it to me once as like addiction whack a mole, which I've since learned is a very North American game. Like people in Europe don't know what I'm talking about when I reference this, but there's this game
Yeah.
at amusement parks where there's this mole popping up from all these holes, and you're just like whacking the mole, and then it pops up from another hole, and you're whacking that hole, and then you're just like
Yeah.
whacking this mole basically.
I know the game. Yes. Yeah. I know the game.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But just for anyone that's listening, that's like, what is whack-a-mole?
Yep.
So I feel like with me, it's like, okay, it's alcohol, done. Like now it's caffeine, done. Now it's food,
Mm,
and but like not even done really. Like I'm just whacking it down and it's coming up as something else. And the binge eating one, I honestly haven't talked about very much publicly. And the reason why is because I had one guest on my podcast a couple years ago who we did talk about this. Um, and then there was a lot of arising issues with people that had experienced disordered eating in the past, like feeling like we were promoting diet culture and it was triggering for them listening. And so, but it's almost made me feel like I then cannot speak about it because I'm trying to be really mindful of their experience and what can be triggering for them. But as a result, I feel like I'm avoiding this whole issue. And so I was wondering, like, I just have a question for you. Has that ever come up where people have said that this discussion feels like it's promoting like diet culture? Have you ever dealt with that? And how have you kind of navigated that conversation?
great question. And yeah, thanks for naming that, sharing that.
Mhm.
That doesn't come up, but what comes up for me, well, one, I haven't talked super publicly about this and my overeating and
Yeah.
binge eating, but honestly, I've never been formally diagnosed.
Yeah.
But when I found the binge eating scale and I did it online, it's like, oh, I'm like high, moderate, almost severe, like years ago.
Yeah.
I went back and retook it and like, okay, I'm in a minimal score now. Um, but what's more come up if I talk about compulsive behavior around food, it's been squashed actually by some people who are like, it's been more like shushed around like I don't have an addiction, or like I'm not
Mhm.
in the group, so it's
Yeah.
like not bad enough, like.
Yeah.
So that's more what comes up to me is just some sensitivity around people who are in recovery and have a strong relationship around that, and kind of some judgment from other people's or projection on um, whether or not mine's valid enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks
I
for
have,
sharing.
yeah.
Well, I'll share one thing first on the diet culture thing and then share about this one. The one thing I'll share about the diet culture thing is that to me, it feels like it's very distinct things. And this distinction is that, like, we're not here promoting, like, it's better to be thin or you should lose weight or blah, blah, blah. That to me it feels like a very clear distinction in my head of like, we're promoting like healthy living and well being through like becoming friends with food and fueling your body with like good food that's going to make you feel well. And so
Yep.
that to me, I feel like is a huge difference. And something that after talking about this with you, it's making me be like, wow, we really need to talk about this more, in mindful and sensitive ways, and definitely make sure that we're not like, we're being intentional to not be triggering that like diet culture and body image kind of thing. But I definitely feel like that is, to me, that seems like the distinction between the two.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
What comes up for me, and maybe that'll be a good play into with Ayurveda too, because I think Ayurveda gets pinned as a diet or a
Yeah.
way of eating, and
Yes.
it's so much more. So um, we can
Yeah.
unpack that in a little bit too.
Absolutely.
But I definitely agree with you in terms of this. Like, I'm not an expert on binge eating, but here sharing my story with overeating and having some binge eating tendencies, and how these spiritual practices have really helped me find more fullness and better relationship with my eating habits and with myself through that process.
Love that. Yeah. And then the second thing that I want to share is, so with the second thing that you said was in regards to like how people perceive kind of like the scale of addiction and being in the group versus not in the group. And it made me think of, Tommy Rosen has the big six, and those are like the big six addictions. And I think it's alcohol, sex, technology, food, relationships. There's something else that I'm missing. Oh, drugs. I'm like, what am I missing? Drugs. Duh. um, so alcohol,
Yeah,
drugs, or maybe they're
I
one.
think you got the six.
I think I
Yeah,
have this.
I mean, you've done more work with that than I have, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I would say is like, with this idea of like addiction whack-a-mole and understanding like we all have these different addictive behaviors. And I think an addiction is anything that gets in the way of you living your life from the way that you want to, like anything that blocks
Mhm.
you living a fulfilled life. And so, I was very much like, obviously alcohol was like a huge issue for me because it was impeding like my judgment and my
Mhm.
and like my life in dangerous ways. But I also think like when I've had binge eating issues, which was post alcohol, then I got into binge eating when I first moved to Bali. And it was because I was in such a high stress level of like running my business and being an entrepreneur and blah, blah, blah. And this was like how I coped with that stress, and then coming into coffee, for example, coffee's been my biggest one for a long time. And I even thought about having a coffee right before we got on this call. But drinking it, knowing that it makes me more anxious, it makes me less able to hold the space. And yet I keep doing it. And so I think that no matter what the substance is, if it's impeding with you living your life in a healthy and fulfilled way, then I don't think there should be a hierarchy of like what is more of a severe addiction versus what's less.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's the compulsive behavior aspect, and then what I understand from the definition of addiction from like the DSM in the psychology world is part of that diagnosis is the social impact.
Yeah.
So we in our cultures, like, we can be addicted to work, and I've been addicted to work in the
Yeah.
past too. Like, that's been something where I've put so much
Yeah.
energy in and been obsessed with. But some of these things like coffee or work or um, whatever might be more culturally acceptable or praised
Right.
than other aspects. And also then you can get into the micro subgroups and cultures too around alcohol, food, technology, things like that. So I love your um, just organic synthesis of an addiction being something that gets in the way of living in your fullness.
Mhm. As you say that, as you say work, I'm like, I actually feel like that might be the sixth one in the big six. Like now I'm curious
You
and I'm
you
gonna,
named you named work when you were going through it.
oh, did I? Okay, okay. Okay. Well, I'll have to
At
Google it
least
after.
I heard that. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering, like, how did you then discover like spiritual practices in Ayurveda? Like, where did that come in on your journey?
Yeah. I think overall, I found discovered the spiritual practice with curiosity and openness.
Yeah.
Um, I like to start there. I grew up in a religious household, so I see spirituality as like relationship and connection to source, God, universe, um, source is like what I like to think of it as. And religions are like the set of rules and guidelines to follow that. So in my religious upbringing, there were definitely moments where I felt connected to something bigger than myself as a young child, adolescent, but it was fleeting. I didn't have a consistency. Um, as I got older in my 20s and felt more separate from the church and those practices, I was kind of floating for a while. Um, and then just my own existential curiosity and crisis of like, what is my purpose here? Like, what is that? And studying different religions, um, and in understanding of purpose, a lot of the books I read kind of just started intertwining with religions and spirituality. And so that raveled and unfolded to things. And, from 20, so my background was I was a college football player. Then I became a college football coach, did that for 6 years. And then I transitioned to being an academic and career advisor. Excuse me. And I specialized with students who didn't have a major. They were undeclared. And through the years of working with them and kind of simultaneously going through my spiritual curiosity, I started noticing I was getting more lighted up by students who kind of had some spiritual outlook on things. I remember there was a guest lecturer came through our university talking about spirituality, and I was going there. So I think those are just some examples of how it was kind of unfolding. And I was in the university in that career and academic setting from 2015 to 2021. Um, so how Ayurveda came in was in 2017. I was living in Northern California in a beautiful place called Humboldt County, where Redwood National and State Parks are. And was my first time living out of like a metropolitan area. I grew up in like suburban San Diego in California. Then I went to do my undergrad in Sacramento, California. So very metropolitan areas. And my family was not very outdoorsy. We didn't go camping. We didn't do a lot of those things. So living in Humboldt, I started, there's a lot of spirituality there. There's a lot of actually strong Native American indigenous presence there too, and wisdom. And I started being more in sync with like, oh, the seasons, and there's farmers markets and there's a lot of agricultural farmers there. And even noticing, like, I remember noticing the moon more, like, oh, it's different, and I'm noticing it more, and just being more in sync. So I remember in 2017, I was curious to learn how to eat more seasonally. There's this wisdom of the earth of like what becomes in season and is ready to harvest at different times actually has some natural balance to it. So I Googled seasonal cookbooks and scrolling through, and I remember I saw something that said Ayurveda. And I was like, what is that? And the book was Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook by Kate O'Donnell. Still a great book. And it's one of the ones I still recommend for people who are starting in Ayurveda, because there's a lot of great Ayurvedic cookbooks with recipes, but a lot of them are pretty elaborate. And Kate does a great job in making it really accessible. So I remember downloading the sample on Amazon or something at the time and reading about the holistic philosophy that where there's no magic pill or magic diet, and what one person needs is very different from another person, and even what one person needs will change from season of year and season of life. And I remember just being like, this is true, and wanting to study that. So I ended up getting that book and just playing with recipes, and it was kind of sporadic. But every season I'd be like, oh yeah, we're shifting into fall. Let me pull out that book and look at the foods that it recommends, and let me go get what I can at my farmer's market, and let me try some of these recipes. And some of them I was like, not having that again. And some of them I was like, wow, this was amazing. I'm going to do that again. so I was doing self-study, and then that led me to getting another book and then another book and starting to self-study until 2021 when I jumped in and did a 1,000-hour Ayurvedic counselor program that did health and life coaching from the foundations and nutrition aspect and then the Ayurvedic psychology aspect.
Oh, so cool. I love how the way you describe it as just kind of like coming across it and then little by little, like getting into the farmer's market. And then all of a sudden you're like doing a counseling course on it. That's so cool. The
Yeah.
way you just kind of little bits led you there.
Yeah, it was. It was like one little thing. I remember I was reading the books, and then I lived in an area that had some Ayurvedic practitioners. And I remember seeing a flyer like, oh, there's an Ayurvedic cooking class at the co op. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to go do that. And I remember one year, like, we were doing a family gift exchange for Christmas, and I was called to put an Ayurvedic book on there as a wish list. And I remember being like, am I doing this? I want another Ayurvedic book. And I was like, okay, sure. And then someone got it for me, and I was like, okay, cool. It was The Science of Life by Dr. Lad. It's a very popular book over here in the US and I'm sure internationally. So I remember those things of just like kind of being that, having those little moments where like, how did I get here?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Love
But then
that.
like, I actually like it. So I'm just going to keep going. It's helping me. So I'm going to keep going.
That's awesome. Okay, so I have a question for you, which actually came up on my most recent yoga teacher training. Someone said to me, "What is Ayurveda?" And what I said to her was, I was like, to me, it's like the sister science of yoga, of like basically food and all the different lifestyle choices that you're using in addition to your yoga practice. But I'm wondering, like, how would you define it?
Yeah. I I would say Ayurveda, the way I think of it, it's a way of living in our fullness. Like you
Okay.
talked about addiction being something that gets in the way of living our fullest life. And I think Ayurveda is a way of living to be in our fullness. So what you said is very common. So Ayurveda is a sister science and a sister system to
Yeah.
yoga. They're both based off of Sankhya philosophy, duality from the Vedic text. Um, and two of the six main darshans, philosophies of the Vedas. So Ayurveda split up. Ayur comes from Ayus, which is like longevity of life, and Veda is wisdom. So it's the wisdom of life or living wisdom when we're actually putting it into practice. And when I, in my courses, and what I like to tell people is, I see Ayurveda as a philosophy, science, and art for discovering ourselves, just fulfilling our purpose, and enjoying our life in the process. And so that's kind of the philosophical view of what Ayurveda is. And you are very right. So Ayurveda has a lot of parts to its philosophy, the five great elements, the Pancha Mahabhutas being a key one, which those form the doshas, and those give us an understanding of our elements and of our senses, so that we can understand and master our senses to find our way back to our sense of self, our consciousness, which in Sankhya would call Purusha, our consciousness. And so our ability to digest our experiences, the food we eat, the impressions we take in through our senses, the emotions and thoughts we have, all that is tied through our ability to digest. And so our that's why food is so big. And Ayurveda says we aren't what we eat, we are what we digest. So that's why there's so much of a big emphasis on that, because we are spirits being human, and from that philosophy, and how we take care of our body and how we nourish ourselves has a big impact. But it goes so much more beyond just the food. But that is usually, especially in the West, it's kind of like asana poses, and the physical practice is how kind of yoga has come, but it's so much more vast. And so Very similar with Ayurveda. The diet is like the way in, the food and how we eat and our relationship to it. But it's also so much more vast.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And so
Yeah.
when you work with individuals in like a coaching and counseling context in Ayurveda, like what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, in general, it's something that I weave into my lens as a coach. I've been fortunate to be a coach pretty much my whole career, in sports, and then a teacher, and then like a life coach for students. And so my real focus on people is helping them live in their fulfillment. And I weave in actually another Vedic wisdom of the Purusharthas. Do you focus on that? Teach the Purusharthas?
Yes, vaguely. I know the four aims of life come from the
Yeah,
Purushartha, right?
yeah,
Dharma.
yeah.
Is that what you're referring to?
Correct. Yeah. So the four aims, the four pursuits, the four desires,
Yeah.
that we have as humans. So dharma, artha, kama, moksha.
Yeah.
Um, and so I call that purpose, prosperity, pleasure, and peace.
Mhm.
So that's been my journey of really just finding fulfillment, and these spiritual practices help that. So Ayurveda, from understanding my nature as a human. So that's one thing Ayurveda does. A lot of people will take these dosha quizzes. What's my constitution or what's my dosha? Um, People want to know that we want to have our labels and things like that. So Ayurveda does have some wisdom in knowing what is my nature. And so everyone's got this unique nature from makeup of these elements and of these energetic tendencies that we call doshas, and knowing how to keep those in balance help us stay in our right relationship with ourselves and can help us live in our dharma. Because if we're sick and in dis-ease, then we're focused on just survival and healing and things like that. But Ayurveda is more than disease prevention and disease uh, treatment, but it's also health promotion and self-actualization. So it has the same end goal as yoga. And so Ayurveda is a framework that I use in understanding where somebody's out of balance. And so I have some clients and that work with me individually that they don't come from me for Ayurveda, but when I'm working with a founder of a company that's talking about a lot of stress, and I'm like, well, tell me about your morning routine. And he has 4 cups of coffee and he's doing a ton of cold plunging and this. He's just like activating his nervous system all the
Right.
time. And then so educating him and giving him some examples on how we can start regulating this. Um, so that's a main way of Ayurveda helping to bring us to balance so that we can then be very intentional and direct of finding our fulfillment in our purpose, prosperity, pleasure, and peace, mixing this balance of our spiritual and material fulfillment in life, because the yogis were not, the philosophies don't talk about separating them. It's talking about merging them is
Yeah.
what this talks about. Um, so it helps in that regard. And then I do have people that are Ayurveda interested and curious, and work with them in addressing their different lifestyle. Like, let's look at your food, and let's look at your sleep, and let's look at your morning practice and your sadhana. Um, and Ayurveda has these set of daily routines called dinacharya. So we can go through and start building some of those into their lifestyle. And as a coach, I really like to start of finding where the momentum can build, like where the interest is in that person's lifestyle, adjusting one or two things, seeing, getting that established, and then building. As opposed to, like we talked about kind of in the beginning, you go to a medicine and a doctor and they might tell you what's wrong and say, here, take this.
Right.
So my work is more of education and accountability and helping with lifestyle change, habit evolution, and empowering them, which that's really a conscious aspect of Ayurvedic medicine, is that it's for everybody, and these things can be accessible. And that's the thing that comes up in my classes sometimes. We're like, well, how don't you think Ayurveda is not accessible? And there's certain herbs or things like that. It definitely comes from the culture of India, so there's some aspects, but the principles of balancing our elements is universal and cross culture. So it's a wisdom that thankfully has survived. I'm sure there were other cultures in all the different continents that had their wisdom, but unfortunately, due to genocide and things like that, we've lost it in a lot of places. And thankfully, we have Ayurveda that is so interconnected with all the Vedic wisdom for us.
Mm, mhm. Wow, that's a beautiful answer. And I have to say that I'm so inspired by this episode. Like I never really had an Ayurveda interest before, and it's really made me curious to look into it and learn more. And I love the way that you're speaking on connecting to so many aspects of yoga philosophy and things that I don't often I don't often speak about with people. I mean, I do often because it's my work, but I just don't find often when I'll have someone on the podcast that this will be like a main focus for them. And so that just it really lights me up to hear those connections between that work and Ayurveda. I think it's really cool.
Some good, yeah. And like Ayurveda is a way of living yoga off the mat,
Yeah.
with your diet and lifestyle. That's like a really simple way to talk about it. Like you did well in what you shared. And it's interesting as I've come to like the yoga space, and just the Vedic world. Like Ayurveda was my gateway to like, okay, I want to know more of this. I want to understand the Purusharthas. I want to understand the yoga philosophy and Ashtanga and all the different karma, bhakti, yana, and Jyotish. So it's just opened my door. And we don't really take an Ayurvedic course without talking about yoga, but there's a lot of yoga that has been without Ayurveda. And so it's definitely becoming more around. But yeah, they're sisters. So they like to hang out.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that connection to it just being a way of living yoga off the mat because there is a
Yeah.
real disconnect, I feel, in a lot of the world for that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that in our health and wellness culture that get thrown out of this is healthy and here's this new science and this. And so Ayurveda gives some frameworks if when you start studying and understanding the elements and their qualities and how everything works in terms of balancing each other, that healthy, you really have to be able to answer for whom and when. Like my teacher always talked about for whom and when. Like, is this good for and is this poison for? Ayurveda, the classic texts, say anything can be medicine or poison based on the person and their circumstance.
Mm,
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
love that. And so we originally, when we scheduled this podcast interview, we were going to talk a little bit about your retreat in Bali. And
Mhm.
now, obviously, well, it was me mostly. I was on this Taylor Swift Europe thing where the interview just kept being postponed. So I'm not sure. Hopefully, this episode can get out before your Bali retreat, but maybe you could tell us a bit about that because that's coming up really soon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So there's still spots available. And so when this comes out, Alex will have the links and stuff in the notes, but it's Balance and Bliss in Bali is the name of the retreat. And you alluded to the place. So we're going to be at Tulus Hati Retreat Resort, a very intimate boutique setting. I mean, you've been there. I've just lived it through your information and working with the staff remotely and stuff. But it's there's going to be like 16 of us tops, including all the leaders there, and it's just outside of Ubud in the rice fields. It's just totally awesome. Um, but Balance and Bliss, so the curriculum is focused on helping the participants leave with a feeling of balance in their self, and feeling blissed in their purpose. So we're
Yeah.
doing yoga, we're doing meditation, we're doing some breath work, we're doing some workshops too to explore these different energies, like understanding how our mix of masculine and feminine energies make up who we are. And then I'm bringing in some Ayurvedic lifestyle and also how to understand the routines so that we can be in that state of balance understand our true self, um, find our sense of dharma and purpose, and really aligned with it, um, is how I like to say it, because the way we find, we're always in our purpose. I like to say it's more just discovering it, like getting the stuff that's out of the way out of it, and then we find the ways to apply it in our life, is what I like to say. So balance and bliss in Bali is, it's gonna be 5 days. So it's December 23rd through 27th, and it's focused on helping you align with your authentic self and your purpose, um, which can be a big thing, especially when we're going through identity transformations, like achieving our sobriety, or now we have it, and who am I? And um, so that's the focus of balance and bliss in Bali.
Amazing. Oh, awesome. Well, that sounds fantastic. And I'm so excited for you to just kind of to come over here. And I feel like it's the perfect place for the work that you're doing, because really on this island, a lot of these principles are practiced by the people living here. So
Yeah, I'm super excited, and I'm coming early to really get acquainted with the space more before hosting the retreat. And I think you're in a retreat the week before, so we'll get to meet after both of ours are done, and so have some time afterwards too. So I feel blessed, and it was definitely a an answering a calling, when I was working with my retreat partner Francisca, and we were talking about putting it on and what we want it to be, and the balance and bliss were coming up, and she threw out, what if we did it in Bali? And I was like, well, that's pretty bold. Let's see. And universe connected with me with you through our friend, and it worked out. And so it's been like, okay, I guess the universe wants this to happen, and here we are. So
some amazing. Okay, I have one more question for you, which is if you had any advice for a younger version of yourself who was struggling with everything that you were struggling with recovering from trauma and then the binge eating issues, what would that advice be?
what comes up initially is like you're doing your best, and like I'm proud of you. um yeah, that's like I think that's been a big thing, just even in positive psychology. You mentioned that earlier, and the belief system that really shapes our perspective of life is the belief that myself and everybody is doing the best. So that would be definitely one thing. um and also, I'm here to be my best version of myself is one of my main beliefs. And so each day is an opportunity, each challenge is an opportunity to find that best. And each joyful moment is to get to experience that best version of myself. And one thing that I do say to myself now when I feel a little off or confused is I ask myself, what would I be most proud of? So I
Mm.
think of, what would Kyle Jason Lietzke be most proud of doing, whether it's going to one event versus the other, or big life decisions or smaller ones. It's been a powerful question, to really bring that pride, which kind of gets a bad rap sometimes, to a more soulful aspect.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, Kyle, this was an amazing, amazing episode. So inspiring. I'm so glad that we finally were able to do it. And really excited to connect with you finally in Bali. And for anyone that's listening and curious about the work that Kyle does, I'm going to pop all of his links in the episode description so that you can connect with him and follow him. And maybe I'll see you in Bali as well.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you for letting me share my story, and spread hopefully some wisdom of Ayurveda with the Sober Yoga Girl podcast crew.